Hello there, Michelle Short here, and I'm delighted to be here on the Pinkfresh Studio channel. Today I'm sharing a shaped card using Petal Perfection. So let's get started. This is the Petal Perfection suite of products. This is the beautiful die set. And then there are also stencils that you can use to colour in the flowers. So I've started off by taking a panel of white cardstock. This is cut to 4 1/4 inches by 5.5 inches. And I'm using some low tack tape to adhere it down onto some scrap grid paper. I go back and forward which is my preferred method to use with stencils. So sometimes I use a sticky mat, sometimes I just use this grid paper. These stencils do have some etched lines in the corners so that you can see where you want to line it up with that panel of cardstock. But these stencils are genius, and to be honest, you really don't need to line them up perfectly, because I will show you as you go along how they line up really nicely. So if you wanted to have a panel of cardstock that was larger than an A2 size, you could definitely do that. So I'm starting off by adding ink blending to the petals, and I'm using the Napa Valley ink cube set. So I'm starting off with the lightest shade here, and I'm going in with a 1/2 inch blending brush. I'm focusing the darker colour towards the base of these petals. So I'm starting off with my brush at the base, and then as I work up to the tip of the petal, I'm going to have less ink on that brush, so it's going to lighten up. So I can go along here and do all of these petal pieces. And the genius thing about these stencils is that they have these little triangles, and you want to add some ink blending into these triangles, and that way not only can you line up the die with the stencil images that you've ink blended, but you can also use these triangles to layer up the different stencils as well if you didn't want to use that size of card panel. So it's really helpful. I'm now going in with the second lightest shade in that collection, and again focusing this colour towards the base of these petals. These petals or flowers are made so that you can use different colours for the different petals. I decided to just use purples throughout them all, but I do think they look really nice having different colours as well. So I went in with that second darkest shade, and now I'm going in with the darkest shade, really adding some depth to the bottom of those petals, and then a little bit on some of the sides of these petals as well. I know that I'm going to go in with the lightest shade next with this brush, so I do like to remove the excess ink from that brush so that I'm not going to contaminate my ink with the darkest shade when I next go into the lightest shade. So I just use an old cloth there, and you can see that it is really well loved. I can remove that low tack tape, and then I can lift off that first stencil. I can then bring in the second stencil, and again they've got those etched lines, but I'm just going to focus on those triangles. So I'm going to make sure that I line up those triangles with the kind of stenciled piece, and then that's going to make sure that they're in the right place. So that's a really great way to be able to do it. So I can just do the exact same thing now with the other petals. So starting off with the lightest shade, going in and kind of adding a base layer of this lightest shade, I suppose. Most of it is going to get covered up, but I do like to have that kind of quite light shade at the tip of those petals. So then I can go in with the next shade there, focusing this colour towards the base of those petals. I'm not going to use all of these flowers on this stencil, but it's nice just to colour them all in, so that I've got options if I decide to use them, or I can save them for future projects. So I can just finish off with this darkest shade, really add some depth to these flowers. And then I can lift off that stencil, and you can see how pretty they are. So for the third stencil, this is some of the greenery. So I'm going in with the Over the Hills ink cube pack, and I'm using the 3 lightest shades from that pack. So I'm starting off with the piece here that is kind of the bottom of the flower, sort of going into where the stem would be. So I'm using the lightest shade, which is Fresh Pear. And then for this leaf here, I don't actually end up using it, but I'm not sure at this point if I'm going to. So I'm just going in with a light layer of this colour, just to kind of have all of it covered over with this shade. But I am still trying to focus more of the darker colour towards the base of these leaves. I can then go in with that middle shade, which is Grassy Knoll. And I'm using that same 1/2 inch blending brush, focusing this darker colour towards the bottoms here, and then more towards the bottoms of these leaves as well. And then I do decide that I want to use a slightly smaller brush, so I'm bringing in the 1/4 inch brush. And this is just going to help me focus that darker colour exactly where I want it. So then I can go in with the darker shade here, which is Key Lime. And just add a small amount of that to the bottom of these pieces at the bottom of the petals. And then that bud there, and then also this leaf here as well. It's just nice to have some areas be darker and some be lighter. So I can lift off that stencil, and then I can go in with the last stencil. And it does look at this point like some of the pieces are going to overlap each other, or some of them might kind of go off the edge of the panel, but they don't once you cut them out. So again, going in with that lightest shade to fill in these stems, and then I've got this other stem with the leaves here as well. Just adding in the base layer of that lightest shade. And then I can go in with the middle shade, still using that 1/2 inch brush. Focusing most of the darker colour towards the base of those stems and also the kind of bottoms of those leaves. And then I do add a little bit towards the top of the stems as well, just so it's a little bit darker where the stem meets the flower. And then I can finish off with that darkest shade. I can then remove that stencil, and that is all the ink blending complete. So I'm going to bring in the Petal Perfection Die, and I'm going to line it up with those triangles there. There are also tiny little circles at the bottom of each of the flowers and the stems. That's so that you can poke them out if you need to, if it gets stuck in the die. But you can actually also see through that to see if there's still kind of green ink blending behind. So that's quite helpful as well, just to be able to check that it's in the right place. So I've held that down with some low tack tape and run that through my die cutting machine. I can now carefully lift off that die, and then I've got all of my pieces nicely cut out. And you can see that the ink blending extends further than where the actual die cuts. So if it's not lined up absolutely perfectly, you've got some wiggle room, which is really very helpful. And then also, like I said, nothing overlaps or anything like that, because the die is actually a little bit smaller than the ink blending. So I've got all of my pieces ready to go, and I did do the same thing again, so that I've got another one of those larger flowers. And I did also cut the stems from white cardstock as well. So I want to work on my base now, and I'm taking the largest die from the Nested Hexagons double stitch dies, and I'm going to cut that from some white cardstock. So just holding that down with low tack tape, and then I can run that through my die cutting machine. I just thought this shape would work really nicely with these flowers. I'm temporarily adhering it down onto that scrap paper again, and I'm bringing in some ink so that I can add a little bit of colour towards the bottom of this panel. So I'm using the Ocean Breeze ink and the 1-inch brush, and I'm using the 1-inch brush because it's going to give me a really nice light application of this ink. I want this to be quite light and airy towards the bottom of this piece. I'm trying not to add too much colour onto my brush over where the panel is. I've done that before and I've managed to kind of splatter some ink onto it. It doesn't really matter too much, but I do want this to be really nice and faded. So I'm going in with where the bottom of the panel would be. I know it's on the right hand side here in the video, but that will end up being the bottom of it. And I'm kind of focusing that colour towards the bottom, and as I go up the panel I'm loosening my kind of strength on that brush, and it's going to lighten up as it goes to the white of the cardstock. So we've got really nice fade there. I can now bring in all of my flowers and stems, and I'm going to work out where I want them all to be placed before I stick anything down. This is really essential for me to do because I like to visually see exactly where everything is going to be placed. Sometimes it doesn't always end up in the exact same place once I've stuck it down to what I thought it was going to be, but I like to get the overall look. So I'm pretty happy with that, so I can start adhering all of these pieces down. I'm going to start off with a base layer of these stems cut from the white cardstock. So I'm adding some Precision Clear Craft glue onto the back of this piece. And I know that I only need one leaf of this stem, so I'm not going to add the glue onto the other leaf here because it's going to overlap the bottom of this panel. And because I am sometimes a little bit heavy-handed with glue, I do like to dab off the excess. So I'm just using that same scrap paper that I used for the ink blending, and I can dab that off. And now I can arrange these onto my panel here. So just figuring out exactly where I wanted that one to be placed. Once I'm happy with the placement, I can press that down. And I do like to use tweezers a lot of the time just so that I can hover things kind of above where I'm going to stick things down, and then I can press them down. So I'm going to do the same thing then for the rest of these stems here. So just adding some glue onto the back and then sticking those down. I can do this one here on the left hand side, and then I can finish off with the one that's going to overlap this one here. I'm then going to flip the panel over and I'm going to cut off the excess. I find it easier doing it from the back of a panel. I'm not quite sure why, but you can use the edge of the shape against the edge of the scissors there, and it's quite helpful to kind of get them as straight as possible. I can now go in with the ink blended ones. So again, I'm adding some glue onto those, dabbing off the excess, and then I can align these pieces up with the white ones underneath. The reason that I did the white ones underneath was purely to have some dimension to these stems. I didn't want them to be completely flat, and for me to try and add foam tape onto the back of these stems was a no-no. So I decided it would be easier just to add the 2 layers of the cardstock for that dimension. I felt that I probably didn't need to do ink blending on them, but you definitely could if you wanted to. But it saved me a little time just doing that white die cuts. So I have placed the ink blended ones on top, and now again I can cut these off at the bottom. I like to do this in layers because sometimes it's a little bit difficult to cut multiple layers of cardstock cutting off with scissors. I can then add some thin foam tape to the top of these petal pieces. I'm not going to add it towards the bottom because it is going to overlap where that kind of circle piece is at the top of those stems. And I'm also being careful here where I'm adding this foam tape. I don't want it on the edge of these petals because they are going to overlap the edge of that cardstock. And this is going to become my card base, so anything that overlaps you're going to be able to see from the back, so I don't want any foam tape showing. So I can just go through and stick all of these down. For this one here in the middle, I just need a little bit of foam tape there towards the top, and then I can bring in that glue because it's going to overlap most of that leaf there. Again, just using my tweezers there to kind of hover it in place, and once I'm happy I can press that down. And then I've just got this last little flower here, adding some liquid glue at the bottom and then a little bit of foam tape at the top. I then want to make this into a card base. So there are a couple of ways that you can do this. You can take a folded card base and line up your die so that it's not going to cut the edge and it's going to keep that fold intact. You can run that through your die cutting machine. Sometimes you might want to then add a panel on top of that, depending on how much of that shape has been cut off at the top. Personally, I like to go with a hinge method. So I'm scoring a line towards the top of this shape here. How much you do is personal preference. I'd like to make it as small as possible, but to also make sure that it's going to stick really nicely. So I've kind of reinforced that there with my bone folder, making sure that it's going to fold up nicely. And then that's going to adhere to my front panel. I personally am happy having just the back as it is. I do make sure that when I'm cutting these pieces that I have a piece of scrap paper at the bottom so that I'm not going to get any cut marks from my cutting pads. But you could definitely add another panel on the back if you wanted to make it look really nice. So I've added some double-sided tape to that hinge there at the top, and now I can add it onto the back of my panel here. So I'm just aligning them up as best as possible, using my desk there to kind of keep them in place, and then I can stick that down and make sure that that's well adhered. And then now I'm just making sure that it opens nicely, and then it stands up really nicely as well. So that's my preferred method of creating a shaped card. I'm now going to stamp my sentiment. So I'm taking the sentiment from the Plumeria Stamp set, and I'm going to stamp it down onto some white cardstock using my mini Misty. I'm going to ink up the stamp with detail black ink. So just inking up that stamp really well. And then I can close the Misty door and just press that down. I'm then going to die cut that out with the Plumeria Die set. So I've got the coordinating die here. I can hold it down with some low tack tape and run that through my die cutting machine. And I did cut another layer from white cardstock as well so that I can layer them up one on top of each other. It's just going to add a little bit extra dimension to that sentiment. So I've added some glue around the edges, and then I've also got a little bit of foam tape that I've added to that card base, and then I can adhere this down on top. And I like using the liquid glue as well as the foam tape so that I've got time to wiggle it in place and make it as straight as possible. And then to finish off, I'm going to add some iridescent dewdrops. So I'm adding tiny little dabs there of the glue just around some of these places here on the card. Sometimes I like to add twos, sometimes I like to just add them as one. And then I can bring in my embellishment tool and lift those up onto the glue. And these are so pretty, these embellishments. They have just got the most loveliest little iridescence to them, and it kind of brings out the colour that you've added onto the card as well, which is really nice. So I can finish off with that last one there at the bottom. And so that is the card finished for today. I really love shaped cards. I think there's something a little bit different. Really pretty, this shape with the flowers. And as you can see, it stands up really nicely. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.